What's up, everybody? This is our last day in Patagonia. Behind me, you can actually see the peak of Fitzroy right now. This is the first day that it's been almost completely clear. And to be honest, we've just been out here trying to collect enough B-roll because a few hours ago, it was completely hazy. We had no idea that the sky was going to open up, and the forecast said the contrary. It said it was going to stay cloudy and maybe even snow tonight. So we were just using our time to explore more of the area, but we happened to stumble upon this really beautiful location as we were driving around. So this is a different view of Fitzroy than we've been shooting. In fact, we can just see the spire behind this mountain in the foreground, and in the deep foreground, we actually have the river that's fed by the glacier. So the glacier melt happens all the way over there, washes all the way down the valley, across these plains here, right in front of my frame, back around and all the way across. So we followed the riverbed. We came to this area where the river starts to move around to the left. And I was immediately attracted to the little rapids here, and as I looked a little bit closer, I actually found some green moss all over these rocks. So it was actually a really good shot to introduce when to use a polarizer. A lot of people who are just getting in photography seem to get a little bit confused about when and when not to use a polarizer. And starting out in photography, you may want to use a polarizer just to change the blue color of the sky or to get a little bit more pop out of the clouds themselves. I don't like to do that because in Photoshop, we can pretty much just slide any contrast slider about 15% to the right and achieve the same effect. Where a polarizer becomes essential is when we're trying to mitigate reflections in the foreground. So if you're shooting a vehicle in the foreground and you have the environment or the clouds that are reflecting on the glass, a polarizer can remove those reflections. In this case, in this shot, if I spin the polarizer so it polarizes the bottom of my frame, in this case the water, it actually removes some of the reflection of the water and lets me see through the water below to the rocks and that beautiful green moss below. You may see my camera rotated into vertical mode. That's the composition that I'm using, but before I set my final composition, I rolled a little bit of video using this camera to show you guys how it works. As I rotate the polarizer in the video, check out the difference it makes when we can actually see through the water being polarized, and when I rotate the polarization off of the water. Notice when the water is not polarized, we're getting more of a reflection from the sky. Now, it may seem subtle, but sometimes subtlety is the key to great photography. Another really interesting thing about a polarizer is it actually gives you about a stop to a stop and a half of extra neutral density, which can be really handy in this kind of situation when we're trying to get soft water. So having one extra stop of neutral density can be really beneficial in these type of shooting environments when we're, one, trying to mitigate the reflections of the water, and two, trying to drag our shutter a little bit longer so that we can pick up the tendrils of water as they streak through the frame. Another thing to consider is this is an effect that we cannot create in Photoshop. We cannot remove white from on top of the water. The only way to actually be able to see through the water in this frame is to actually put the polarizer on and work with these settings in camera. This specific polarizer is actually part of a travel photography filter kit that I developed alongside with Format High-Tech. And the really cool thing about this isn't just the high quality output that you get, it's actually that it attaches to the filter holder itself. Even more specifically, it attaches onto the front of the adapter ring. Right now I'm shooting with the GFX 50S and the 23mm, which is an 18mm equivalent in full frame format. The front of that lens has a thread of 82mm. Now the cool thing about this polarizer is the step rings go depending on the size of the lens thread that you have, and the polarizer actually screws right onto the front. Then that attaches to the filter holder itself. So this one polarizer that I have can be used with almost all of my lenses. Now that we've covered how polarization can help mitigate reflections on reflective surfaces, let's cover the camera settings and my composition. As you can see, I've switched to a vertical format. The reason is I wanted to not only force this polarization example, I also wanted to use a deep foreground subject of the water. Now, truth be told, this is not the best view of Fitzroy. In fact, Fitzroy, even though it's fully revealed, is just barely visible behind this ridge in the foreground. Again, I had no idea the sky was going to clear up, but this is still a perfect example to shoot a beautiful composition and see the tip of Fitzroy. This is the first time in 4 days we've actually seen the mountain completely unobscured by clouds. Where I'm sitting here, The rapids kind of fall over high rocks onto low rocks, maybe about 6 to 8 inches, but it zigzags, kind of comes forward and moves back through the frame. So take a look at this image. First of all, notice how we have a deep foreground interest. And what I mean about deep foreground interest is that I've actually taken a wide-angle lens and I've rotated it down to focus mostly on the foreground and use that as a deep leading line into the background. So here you can see the green rocks on the left, the twisting of the water rapids kind of coming through the bottom of the frame, wrapping around to the right, and then pushing itself back into the mountain. You can also see that we have a mostly clear sky, but the target is going to be capturing it at its sunset, and hopefully we'll have some nice colors too. We've talked about the composition. Now let's talk about how I'm capturing this image. This time, I'm actually going to reverse engineer the process a little bit. What I'm doing right now is setting the camera into interval timer mode, shooting every minute, because I'm trying to capture the light on the clouds and the sunset and every bit of Fitzroy clear. So that's what I'm focusing on right now. F8, focus on the background, 3 exposure brackets with an EV shift of -1. So I'm getting a -2, a -1, and a 0. I'm shooting 3 exposure brackets because I have a feeling that I'm going to need to at least have an exposure, an underexposed exposure, just for the highlights on the mountain and potentially the clouds if the sun really lights them up intensely. Before I left my camera in interval timer shooting mode at F8, just capturing the background, I actually captured the foreground a few different ways. Remember how I said that a polarizer gave me an extra stop of neutral density? Well, that came in really handy here, because 20 minutes earlier it was much brighter out here and I had to force a longer exposure in camera. You guys know that every time we force a long exposure in camera by turning our f-stop all the way up, in this case it can go all the way up to f32, that causes diffraction, so I always like to shoot a base frame just in case. So the first step to this scene, I focused on the background, set it to f8, and shot the 3 exposure brackets. The next thing that I did is I went up to f22 so I could soften the water a little bit more. Now that did not drag the shutter a lot. It didn't even bring it to a quarter of a second, but it was enough to get small tendrils of water to begin to appear in the foreground. Then I ramped it all the way up to f32, and if you take a look at this example, you can see we really start to see those cool shapes, the way that the rapids are moving and the water is twisting around and creating white lines. Now remember that f32 and f22 are going to cause a lot of diffraction, but since it's already kind of a soft object in the foreground all covered by water, that doesn't necessarily matter. But here's the thing, I'm shooting medium format and I have a shallower focal plane because of that. So I decided to focus stack this as well. Now, truth be told, I don't know if I need to focus stack this because the water itself is causing those rocks to be pretty blurry. But just in case, I always like to have the exposures if it does make a difference in the foreground. The reason being is really close to the bank, just past these rocks, there's actually little bits of moss sort of hanging off the rocks. So my thought was maybe if I focus stack and focus on the foreground, I can capture that and have it be a little bit more sharp. Worst case scenario, I don't need any of those exposures and I can just delete them later in post. So in order to capture the foreground, I just moved my focus square down a little bit closer to the bottom of the frame, refocused the image, and then reshot at f8, 22, and f32. My thoughts being f8 is going to be closer to a true frame of the water actually frozen in time, f22 is going to be slightly soft, and f32 is definitely going to be soft, and we're going to accentuate those tendrils of water. In these types of situations, you want to be careful to not expose for too long. More exposure will actually destroy all that hard work you put into using a polarizer, and here's why. The reason is the water's moving, these rapids are moving, so the white that I'm getting in the foreground isn't from the reflectivity and is not the reflection of the sky. It's actually the white water of the rapids moving across the water itself. So if I left the camera shutter open for 15 seconds, more of that water would accumulate over top of the rocks that I'm being very careful to try to reveal. So instead, I would say with this type of rapidly moving water, I'd cap your exposures around a half second max. This is the best sky we've had so far on this trip, and as you can see, the sky's starting to light up and we can still see Fitzroy, the beautiful mountain. Not only that, is to my surprise, the lighting changed quite a bit more. Now remember how I said I had shot everything? I'm going to go ahead and shoot all of those brackets I just talked about one more time. The reason being is I always like to have a fresh set of everything. All the brackets, all the focus bracketing, all the exposure brackets, everything I shoot as the light changes. In this case, I'm seeing little reflections of the sky in the background and in the whitewash itself. Now that I've reshot everything closer to the sunset, let's take a look at what I captured previously before the sunset and what I've just captured during the sunset. Bear in mind, these exposure times are going to be a little bit different, but generally what you're going to see is that same foreground of green rock still looks pretty good, but at the middle left and the middle right, just at the other end of this river, you can actually see the light reflection from the sky. It's actually a little pink. Subtle, yes, but you definitely want to try to capture it just in case you want to use it. Let's also examine the difference between my exposure times themselves. First of all, take a look at this half-second exposure. Notice how we get the tendrils of the water. It's starting to look like it's softened. I think it looks pretty good. Now let's take a look at a 1.5 second exposure. Notice how it does change. It does become a little bit more soft, but not dramatically so. Now let's go up to 3 seconds and see how much it changes. It does change a little bit, it just gets more and more soft. So if we go up to 6 seconds, it is adding a little bit more white from the rapids to the frame, and we're losing the detail inside of the tendrils of the white lines themselves. Other than that, after about 3 seconds, it all gets to be fairly similar. So again, with fast-moving water like this, I always recommend about a half-second exposure up until about 1.5 seconds. That should give you a good mix between both softness and texture. It's amazing to me how quickly the light changes here this time of year. As you can see behind me, the mountains are kind of turning blue. Fitzroy's still revealed, but on the right you can kind of see those clouds. They're not looking so great. They're kind of just dark, dull, and gray. All of the really nice clouds have moved off to the left. They've started to lose their color, and they're going to turn flat and white very soon. Today is also very unique because I'm having the opposite issue that I've been having here the entire time in Patagonia, and that's this time, the sky's way too clear. Every other time the clouds have been blocking the mountain, and now we almost have a crystal clear sky. So at this point, conditions are not going to get any better. I'm going to go ahead and pack it up. And the next time I see you guys, we're going to bring all of this into post-processing. We're going to see what exposure time looks best for the water in the foreground. We're also going to see what time of day works best for the reflections. We're going to put it all together, and then we're going to have to decide if the sunset was too clear or if we have to add some texture back into the sky. But we'll make that decision once we can see everything on a bigger screen. Welcome back to the post-processing studio. Today we're going to work on the raw files from the area that I call the Mossy River. In fact, we were just scouting different locations and the sky kind of opened up, surprised us, revealed what we can see of the mountains from this location, and it was a really good opportunity to show you guys how to use a polarizer in the field and how to mitigate reflections. Truth be told, I don't think this is a portfolio shot, but it does have some interesting challenges we need to work through in the blending process. Let's jump right into Lightroom and take a look. So I have 4 files associated with this. I have 3 exposures for the Mossy River, so that's very underexposed to be able to get the sky. We have a backlighting situation again where this is harshly lit from the back. This is a middle exposure, kind of a balance of both, and then this is overexposed for the foreground. Fourth file that I have associated here is a long exposure, and looking at the settings off to the right, that's f18 1 second as opposed to 1/5 at f8. So we know diffraction kicks in for the background, but we have these beautiful soft tendrils of water to add in. But the first thing we need to do is balance this. We're actually going to have to do that in a few stages, and we're going to have to use some luminosity masking as well. First things first, let's go ahead and start our base PSD. I'm going to export this with Previous and get it into Photoshop. And we'll name this Original Raw. Back in Lightroom, let's make our adjustments. First thing I want to do, let's go ahead and scroll down, get rid of that sharpening once again, and let's change this to Adobe Landscape to give it a little bit more color and contrast. Right click, Develop Settings, Copy Settings, check None, and let's go ahead and select, where is it? Sharpening, Treatment, and Profile. Let's just go ahead, right click, and paste to those settings. Now let's make some adjustments to this middle exposure. First, let's go ahead and bring the exposure up a whole stop. We'll make this a little dramatic, but let's bring the highlights down 50, the shadows up 50, and back off on the whites 50. So 50, 50, 50. Let's also do the same thing in the sky, but what I actually want to do is just bring the shadows up a little bit. So the shadows actually, we're going to set to 25, which actually was my previous setting inside of Lightroom. How convenient. All right, so this looks pretty good. Let's move on to the overexposed file. If I look in between from here to here, they're pretty close. I'm actually going to let this pretty much be straight out of camera, Adobe Landscape, that copied over. Let's go to the underexposed one. This exposure is going to control those extreme highlights, but we're still going to have to get it to be as close as possible. So bring that exposure up. Let's bring the whites back 75. And let's do the same thing in the shadows. Let's bring that up 75. Next, select all three, export with previous, use unique names. Next, let's bring all these in, select all, copy, close, master composition right here, and we'll paste. Next, we'll go ahead and take this one, select all, copy, close, paste. Here, select all, copy, close, and paste. So this should be pretty obvious. We have the adjusted, so we'll call this adjusted, raw. We have the highlights, and we have shadows. First thing, let's start with the shadows. Shadows are going to be an easy blend because I really just need the foreground. So I'm going to create a new mask, G for the gradient tool, and I'm just going to draw from about here to here, locking shift to enable that that's linear. So we have the shadows blended. Now for the highlights, we're going to have to do something a little bit different. I'm going to leave them off, or this layer highlights disabled, and we're going to create a luminosity mask. So we're going to blend this layer using a custom mask and a luminosity mask to select the highlights. So I'll go into the channels here, and it's really easy to create a highlights layer. I'm going to command click RGB. With that loaded, go to layers. I'm going to create a new folder, and that's going to create a selection just for the highlights. I can take a look here and you can see that just the highlights are selected. Let me go ahead and name this highlights. If I enable this layer, move it to this folder, now you can see that I'm basically just having that layer exist inside of the highlights. So what's that doing? Well, it is correcting the sky more or less, but what it's also doing is washing out the rest of the image. So I only need that for a little portion. So what I'm actually going to do is mask this out, and I'm actually just going to custom mask in this using a gradient. I'm going to select this option here for this type of gradient. I'm going to draw from about here to here. And we'll take a look here. So now those highlights. I missed it a little bit. Let's start in the middle about here to here. And let's show this. If I hit the backslash key, you can see that much is selected. Well, that looks pretty good. Let me go ahead and reset this again to normal. Let's do that one more time. So from here to about here. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the result. So you can see now I'm only affecting that layer, I'm only affecting the tops of the mountains, and it's sort of running off right into the sky. So really easy with a quick gradient ramp, and with this highlights luminosity mask, I can quickly blend all of this back together fairly seamlessly right off the bat. Let's go back into Lightroom, and let's talk about the water layer. Well, again, it's pretty close. So here's this layer to this layer. It is really close. I'm just going to export it as is with previous. Select all, copy, close, and paste. And we're going to call this Focus FG for foreground. Now let's take a look at the before and the after. So if I do this off and on, one, the water changes really dramatically. Two, if I zoom in here, you can see that these rocks are much more in focus than they were before. But most importantly, if I zoom in especially to some of the surrounding detail in the background, you can see that everything moves. And that's because I changed the focus from the background to the foreground. So what we're going to need to do is select everything here. Shift Option Command E will create a blended result layer and the focus foreground. And what I'm actually going to do is take the focus foreground and the blended result, go up to Edit, Auto Align Layers. We'll leave everything to default and click OK. Now, if I turn this on and off again, everything lines up perfectly. So let's zoom out a little bit. And what I'm actually going to do, really easy to blend this in, a new mask, gradient, we'll reset it to the simple ramp, and I'll actually do it from here to here. And you can see now we have this to this. Next step, this needs a lot of work. Let's make a new layer out of everything. Shift, Option, Command, E. I'm going to go into Adobe Camera Raw Filter. So Adobe Camera Raw Filter, ACRF is the name. Filter, Camera Raw Filter. First, let's warm it up a little bit. Let's bump the exposure globally just a little bit. And let's pull the shadows up again just a little bit. Next, let's get a little bit more selective with a gradient. And then we'll pull this down all the way here. Reset this tool. Let's warm it up even more. Let's give it some contrast with the dehaze. And to compensate in the shadows, let's go ahead and bring those shadows up just a little bit. Now let's just select the top of the sky. Reset this again. Let's cool it off and add just a little bit of magenta. Take a look here and apply the result. Overall, that looks pretty nice, but I went a little overboard with the clouds. And it's really tough when you're dealing with extreme highlights, and especially these warm tones. But when you start to see this sort of color fringing, this is a good point to know that you pushed it a little bit far. These highlights and these reflected colors look pretty nice in the mountain, but what I'm actually going to do is just create a mask, and with the brush tool, with a low flow, I'm actually just going to paint this out, just by hand, right on top, just like this. So this area is just going to be rolled back and less intense. Basically anywhere where I feel like the sky became too blown out from the correction, because the rest of it honestly looks pretty good. I like that. Right about there. We'll go ahead and zoom out and I'll show this. And with and without the mask on it, you can see that I've gotten rid of those areas. Might even want to bring this out a little bit more so we can just kind of do the surrounding pixels. So that part of the intensity of the sky stays the same. We get the color correction on the rest. Once again, it's never going to be a portfolio shot, but let's go ahead and take it a little bit further anyway. First thing, I want a midtones mask because I want to add some midtones contrast. And we've already created a few custom action sets, so let's go ahead and create those luminosity masks right now. Perfect. I'm going to command click the midtones, go to the layers, and I'm going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this midtones. I'm going to create a new curves layer, and we're going to do a simple midtones contrast to this. Pull some of that contrast down. Let me see, make sure those highlights, that's looking pretty good. Really pulling these darks down. We'll turn this on and off. Next thing that I want to do is I want to adjust just the shadows here, being this dark portion of the water, while leaving these highlights alone. So let's go to the channels and take a look at what we have. So we have highlights and we have shadows. This is pretty good, but I don't feel like it's enough. So let's go ahead and create a super shadows layer, shadows 2, by loading shadows, Shift, Option, Command, click to intersect, and we'll create a new one here, and we'll call it shadows 2. Perfect. With that still loaded as a selection, I'll go up here, create a new folder with a mask, calling it Shadows 2. First, curves, and I want to bring the values up in this area, so I'm going to gamma boost it. You can see that's going to add a little bit of gamma, so it's washing out some of the tones, but it's also bringing up some of these tones of the rock. But I only want that to happen on the bottom of the image, so we're going to add a gradient ramp from about here to here. Perfect. And we'll just go ahead and adjust this until it's exactly where we want it. Too much, roll it back just a little bit. We'll name this Gamma. We'll create another one. But this time, let's do a vibrance layer. Let's add 20% vibrance and some saturation. It's going to be subtle, but it should bring those colors and values out just a little bit. And as I toggle it on and off, you can kind of see that blue get a little bit more intense. I only want it on the bottom of the image, so I'm just going to quickly link it to the gamma layer. And we'll call this vibe/sat. Next, simple contrast. And let's just add 20% contrast back in. Perfect. And we'll link that to the bottom as well. So now on the bottom, we go from here to here. Now, any of these can be adjusted. This mask controls these two layers. But if I go in here, I can change the intensity, so I can bring that up a little bit more. I can always go back into the vibrance here and add even more vibrance to this, even something around 30 without it breaking, which is really nice. I can also go into the contrast here, add or subtract some of the contrast. Obviously, too much, you'll start to notice. So somewhere around 20 to 25. So I'm going to make this 25, just like that. And we'll go ahead and close this and take a look before and after. So it's really creating some more visual interest to the foreground, which, to be honest, is the most interesting part of this image. Something else that would be fun to do to this image is some dodging and burning. Let's go ahead and option click, create new layer, dodge/burn. Change the mode again to overlay and fill it. Perfect. Now what I want to do here, and I'll zoom in on this so we have more detail, is really address the detail in the water. So if I go to the brush tool, change the flow to something really low, like 2 to 3%, and I start to burn here, you can see that I'm going to start to darken the water. If I start to dodge, I can start to brighten areas. So let's bring out some of this. So those nice mossy rocks that I was trying to capture, the whole reason I used the polarizing filter to begin with was to help bring out some of this detail. So let's go ahead and bring more of that detail out. All the way down here, foreground, beautiful highlights, beautiful mossy layer. It's starting to look really nice. It comes alive, actually. I just wish the background was better. And in this tutorial, to be honest, we've already done so much perspective blending. I'm not going to put a new mountain in the background. But this is a good example where the foreground just looks great, but this view of Fitzroy and the mountain spires themselves just isn't as visually interesting as the other locations. But this foreground, if we could just put this right in front of Fitzroy, we had those spires right in front of this, it would be pretty awesome, to be honest. So let's go ahead and darken these pools, and really start to accentuate this. And you can see as I darken it, it does get rid of some of those tendrils, but it also pulls some of that specular highlight back, which can give us more detail overall. Same thing here, same thing down here. And then if I come back with white, what I actually want to do is just do this really small areas, just so it brings up the highlights and looks like there's more sort of tendrils, I like to call them, or whiskers of water coming off. And as I start to sculpt this foreground, I start to really like this image until I go up to the backlit, uninteresting mountains. So sometimes you win some, sometimes you lose some, sometimes you just don't like the location whatsoever. But each time you shoot, you have unique challenges and different things to overcome. So for a foreground, this is really actually nice. And if I start to zoom into the detail that I was able to pick up with the focus stacking plus that long exposure of 1 second, it's really quite beautiful. The polarizer was able to bring all of this detail through, allow us to see all of this. Without the polarizer, this is what would have happened. So the reflections would have been really pretty, but with the polarizer, we were able to see down into the water, really deep into this image. Let's go ahead and zoom out just a little bit. So with the dodge and the burn, you can really see this coming alive and having more character. The one last thing that we'll always have to address when we're dealing with any type of focus stacking, especially when we start to put multiple layers of focus in a stack, are these little pixels on the edge. So just to finish this up, let's go ahead and crop it. Let's clear this ratio a little bit, and I'm just going to drag this to the edges here. That looks pretty good. And my snap is enabled, so it's going to be a little disproportionate, not as close as I want. And I'll go ahead and pull this down just a little bit to compensate and hit return. Let's zoom it full screen and talk about everything that we've done. So this is the original RAW. Straight out of camera, looking really flat. We've had a lot of backlit situations in Photographing the World 4 so far. Then we adjusted the middle RAW, brought in the shadows portion of the RAW, and then fixed the highlights with some luminosity masking. We didn't have to take it that far to fix it. We then ended up with the blended result, brought in the focused foreground and the long exposure version of 1 second, used the camera raw filter to kind of unify it, added contrast, shadow intensity, color in the foreground, and a dodge and burn. So originally we went from this to this. And there you have it. Once again, we have a great foreground. It was the perfect excuse to use a polarizer, but we have an underwhelming background. So this by itself would never be a portfolio piece, but it was still fun to work together from start to finish anyway.